Parents, listen up. This one is for you. Let's get ready now for a different looking school year in just a few weeks. There's just 1 month until the kids go back to school. And for parents concerned about their kids' health and working from home, there's a difficult choice that lays ahead. What should parents know about the school year and their employment? We're joined now by Alex Lucifero, an employment lawyer with Samfiru Tumarkin LLP. Alex, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Annette.
All right, I want to put a bunch of scenarios to you and get the answers because a lot of families have very different circumstances. So there's a lot of different possibilities on what September will look like. Let's start with this one. I'm not going to send my kids back to school and the parent needs to stay home. What does that mean for the parent's employment in order to stay home because they don't want to send their children to school?
That very well will be a difficult situation, and then it's actually a question that we've received a couple of times now since Thursday, since this was announced. So a parent in that situation, a parent that is not willing to send their child to school, despite the fact that the government has effectively opened up the schools and asked everybody to go back, or the children at least to go back, is in a tough spot because they effectively are not going to be accommodated by their employer, or to put it properly, they're not. There's no obligation on the part of an employer to accommodate that parent because the parent has a solution, and the solution is sending your child to school. And so with that solution in play, an employer does not have to accommodate a parent in a case like that, because again, the parent has an option, the parent has a solution. In the case of, as we have been up until now, parents haven't had an option, right? The schools were closed. They were ordered closed by our government. Daycares and summer camps are operating at a very limited capacity, if at all. And so in cases like that, where effectively a parent has no option but to stay home and care for their child, then an employer has to accommodate. They have to accommodate either the infectious disease leave under the Employment Standards Act or under human rights legislation. But again, now that parents have an option of returning their children to school, however they may feel about how safe that is or not, employers are allowed to say, well, because you are allowed to send your children to school, you now have an obligation, employee, to attend work.
Okay. All right. Next scenario. For a parent who sends their kid back to school, the child gets sick with COVID, has to come home. Can the parent, and this could be another scenario that's very similar, or the child comes home and spreads COVID to grandma or grandpa who lives in the home. Can the parent therefore have time off without being penalized or having to use vacation time to be at home to take care of the child, or perhaps even grandma or grandpa living in the home who are now sick with COVID?
Yeah, it's a great question, and of course, all of our fears is that that's going to happen, right? So this is a very real possibility. When it comes to caring for your child, Annette, then the answer is unequivocally yes. If you have a child sick at home and you are the one that has to care for that child, again, if you have no other options in terms of child care, then you are absolutely allowed to stay home to care for that child. And again, you are protected under human rights legislation in Ontario. That's the Ontario Human Rights Code. And you cannot be punished by your employer for that reason. You cannot be fired. You cannot be laid off. You cannot be again, punished in any kind of way for having that child care responsibility. It's what we call protection under family status under the Human Rights Code. Okay. It's actually quite different, however, when it comes to caring for another family member or a parent. Actually, that doesn't necessarily apply to any other family member. And so you may very well not have that protection under human rights legislation in having to care for a parent. There is some protection right now under, again, it's called the infectious disease leave under the Employment Standards Act. That may apply to another family member, so not necessarily a child. Yeah. But that may very well change. That infectious disease legislation may very well end sooner rather than later. And so I think if you're caring for a child, you're safe. If you're caring for another family member, it becomes much more complicated. And if you're receiving a hard time from your employer, you probably want to get legal advice in a case like that.
Okay, high school students, next scenario, are going back 50% of the time. The other 50% of the time, they'll be at home for online learning. Let's say it's a grade 9, grade 10 student. Do parents have to, does an employer have to give the parent accommodations in order to allow that parent to be home on the days that the child is home?
Yeah, another great question. And the answer is Yes. So again, in a case where, let's say, a high school student who cannot stay home on their own is going to be home, then yes, you as an employer have to accommodate a parent in a situation like that. Because again, the parent will have no other option but to care for their child, but to stay home and care for their child. With one caveat, and I'm going back to this principle, and it's an important one. As a parent, you may very well be obligated to look for alternative daycare solutions, whether that's another family member or hired help. You have to explore those options as a parent. It's part of your obligation as an employee to do whatever you can, within reason, of course, to make efforts to attend work. If you've explored those options as a parent and you have no choice but to stay home and care for your child because they're learning from home, at least part of the time, then you will absolutely be allowed to do that.
Great information from you this morning, Alex. As always, appreciate your time. A lot of parents hopefully have some answers from you this morning. Thank you.
My pleasure, Annette. Thanks for having me.